Good evening, everyone. Let's bow in. So welcome to the Buddhist Path of Awakening course. We are continuing to examine or to learn about and study Madhyamaka and Ch22. Michael is going to take it away this evening. Go ahead, Michael.
Welcome, everyone. Last week we talked about ground Madhyamaka. Ground Madhyamaka is beginning with an understanding of the two truths. And last week we talked quite a bit about relative truth, or kunza, which was the word that Trungpa Rinpoche sometimes used for relative truth. And tonight's reading goes a little bit more into ultimate or absolute truth, or tundam, as he calls it. But to begin with, even the title of this chapter is provocative in its own right. And the title, Experiencing Reality in its Fullest Sense, is one of the definitions of absolute truth, tundam, ultimate truth, that Trungpa Rinpoche gives us in this chapter. One of the definitions of tundam is that it's experiencing reality in its fullest sense. And so I think we begin by just contemplating for a moment whether we experience reality in its fullest sense. And I think if we think about our experience in life, let alone in meditation, we realize that often we don't. That just as Tulku Ujin said in the reading on Shamatha Vipassana that we read, we can spend a lot of time engaged in the habit of thought following thought, creating entire dream worlds, storylines that we tell ourselves, and can walk for blocks, or worse yet, drive for blocks, and not really have any sense of where we are, what we passed, what we've seen. At the same time, we have the capacity to wake up. When we see this in practice, we come back even when we get lost in dreams, and we get caught up in stories, and caught up in our thoughts. And so we realize there's a capacity within us to experience reality, that we recognize through meditation practice that there's a very noticeable difference between what our experience is when we're present and when we're not. And we can feel this difference in meditation practice. So in this chapter, Trungpa Rinpoche has quite a bit to say about ways in which we might begin to experience something about what ultimate truth, absolute truth is. He says it's the real truth opposed to the relative truth, but he also says it's quite difficult to explain. And that's when he gives the definition, that one of the definitions of tundam is that it's experiencing reality in its fullest sense, without regarding any individual style as tangible from the ego-clinging point of view. So it involves letting go of twofold ego, letting go of any solid sense of ourself, solid sense of what the world around us is. It's a non-dual, non-conceptual experience of immediate presence. At one point in this chapter, he'll say that Ch22 is present. And so to talk about this, he says that he'll drop the Yogacara viewpoint that we talked about last week. Remember, he said that the Yogacara, which was one of the two great philosophical schools in the Mahayana tradition, that the Yogacara the Yogacara presentation was excellent for understanding relative truth, which is what we talked about last week. But he says in this chapter, we're going to explore from the point of view of the Madhyamakans. The Madhyamakans have a much more direct approach to recognizing ultimate truth, or rather letting go of the fixations and reference points that cause us to be caught up and not see relative truth. And he can say absolute truth is that we have no truth. And he says that he doesn't really want to discuss this in terms of hypothetical theories about absolute truth, but rather build some kind of ground for experiencing the groundlessness of absolute truth. So that's what's going to happen in this chapter. He's going to build some kind of ground for experiencing the groundlessness of absolute truth. You can think of ground as a reference point, something that we could stand on. And groundless, I actually looked up the definitions of groundless and groundlessness, being the curious person that I am. Groundless means not based on any good reason. So it says, like, for instance, a groundless fear is a fear that there's really no reason for. And groundlessness refers to the lack of substance in something, lack of value or substance in something. So he wants to build some kind of ground, some kind of starting point through which we might experience a sense of the groundlessness, the lack of substance that is the nature of absolute truth. And he says, because just knowing absolute truth, and I think here he means knowing absolute truth in a conceptual sense, or being able to give a definition, doesn't really help. The question is, how do we know it's absolute truth? And so with that, the next two sections of the book provide some of the ground that he talks about for experiencing groundlessness. So there's a section in which he talks about shunyata, or emptiness. And then this sets up his asking a lot of questions aimed at getting us to reflect on, how do we know what we think we know? And he does this in order to get us to see, and perhaps even see through, some of the fixations of conceptual mind. It would have been interesting to have actually heard the talks that this chapter were based on. It would be interesting to hear a recording of how he presents, because my feeling is that these questions that he asks and the way in which he asks them weren't just rhetorical, but he really wanted us to look at what we think we know, how we know, and how this knowing comes about. That he really wants us to contemplate the questions that he asks, which we'll go through in a few minutes. And so, as we read at whatever pace we do, and we might imagine whatever we might imagine. But there might have been a lot of space between questions. They might have come all at once. It's really, there's no way to really know. That's if we were actually to hear the talk. He might actually have looked at various people in the audience and really, again, to get people to really take these questions and really think about, what do they mean? What kind of experience do they evoke? But in any case, the point seems to be that we're being asked to look at our actual experience and not just engage superficially with concepts and safe definitions. And that through this contemplation, he really wanted to poke holes in our kunza, this all-covered quality of conceptual mind, the dressed up relative reality, and come to recognize, or at least glimpse, something of absolute truth, and the ultimate groundlessness of all the concepts, reference points, and fixations that we hold on to. As he said, he wants to build the ground for experiencing the groundlessness of absolute truth. And with that, perhaps we could recognize something that ordinarily, because we follow thought with thought and get caught up in ideas, that we just don't ordinarily notice because we're absorbed in our thoughts and our feelings. So the next section is shunyata and Buddha nature. This is where we're, again, building the ground through which we might experience the groundlessness of absolute truth. He says here that the meaning of shunyata is emptiness. And we've talked a lot about exactly what this emptiness is. It's not simply negation, but rather the lack of real substance, real self, a real permanent entity in things. It's the truth that things in the world are not permanent, they're not singular, and that they're interdependent. In other words, their appearance depends on other conditions. And in turn, things that we see are conditions for other things as well. So the things don't have a separate individual self, and that's really what emptiness is. When causes and conditions change, and there are teachers who really present shunyata, emptiness, in terms of interdependence, the interdependent nature, the interconnected nature of all things. When causes and conditions change, things appear and disappear, things come and go, arise and subside, and that's the true nature of things all the time, whether we recognize it or not. So the meaning of shunyata is emptiness. He says the nature of shunyata is being able to see the world in the absence of dualistic fixation. So an experience of shunyata, the nature of shunyata is beyond dualistic fixation, I and other, beyond perceiver and perceived, attitude and attitudiner, all the other different ways in which he talked about dualism that we ordinarily experience. And he says that the function of shunyata is to see that dualistic fixations are not particularly appropriate or valid by recognizing the negativity of its own nature, the absence of true self, the absence of real substance in things. He says then we could see further positivity, which is actually more what comes up later in the chapter. He says the awareness of shunyata could act as a present memory in the sense that its presence is never lost. It is a present memory rather than a past record. And I think what he's talking about here is it's easy to think sometimes that, well, things are real, and then conceptually we analyze them and think about them, and then that we make them unreal. But the reality is they were unreal all along. And if we were actually fully present in our experience, if we were really actually experiencing reality in its fullest sense, that's more how we would see things, because we wouldn't be so attached to a sense of self and a sense of other, the dualism that, that shunyata ultimately cuts through. He says, from shunyata's point of view, everything is present. So again, we're talking about direct, immediate experience, not, something that happens as an afterthought. And he begins here with a little bit of some of the questions that he really gets into in the next section. He questions whether we really know what things are, whether we really know what blue is or what green is, and that this is a way of trying to cut through or let go of conceptual mind. And basically, the more we look, the more we look at our present experience and really think about what it is, how it is that we experience things, he says we can't find any permanent, fundamental, satisfying ground on which to stick our concepts. He says things seem to be arbitrary, but we see that our perceptions are also arbitrary. And he says, because such dualistic fixations are just temporary. And if we really, again, look at our experience, we see that this is true. We see things come and go in meditation practice. We see things come and go in our lives. We don't really pay much attention to the insubstantial nature of things because we get so caught up in whatever we're dwelling on in the moment that we forget that just a moment ago, 5 minutes ago, a day ago, something else was completely important, something else was urgent, something else was present, immediate, in a different way. So what's important and compelling in one moment is gone in the next. And because dualistic fixations are temporary, he says they really do not play an important role in our understanding. He says the reason shunyata is emptiness is because our perceptions of the phenomenal world have no characteristic of any substantial nature. And again, this is what we would realize if we just reflect for a moment on the truth of impermanence and interdependence. He says they're arbitrary and dependent on our particular state of mind. And we know this is true. The world looks very different to us when we're excited and happy as opposed to when we're tired or depressed. The same things that can be inspiring at another time can be depressing. And we realize it's actually our state of mind. It's not, we get caught up and we lose sight of, we forget our awareness. We don't experience reality in its fullest sense. We experience reality in an extremely limited, caught up, absorbed sense. So how does the shunyata experience function? He says by seeing through lies and falsity, basically, we begin to understand the groundlessness or the egolessness of totality. And in other places, he'd say things that groundlessness can be unpleasant from an ego-centered perspective because we have to let go of security, comfort, familiarity. And we might experience this at first as anything from a gnawing uncertainty or insecurity to full-blown panic. But if we can let go and actually relax with our experience of groundlessness, we might experience something different. We can experience openness. We can experience the fullness of things. We can experience freedom and possibility. He says with this, we could even say the realization of the wakeful quality of enlightenment itself is empty. Otherwise, we end up fixated on something else in our experience. We grasp onto something as a possession of ego. He says the definition of Buddha nature, or Tathagata Garbha, is that it's free from preconceptions, and that the quality of Buddha nature is that we contain enlightened, wakeful qualities in us that are free from dualistic obstacles, and that the function of Buddha nature is to awaken us to the actual Buddha nature itself so that we can realize greater wakefulness or Buddhahood. He says if there are any concepts attached to Buddha nature, then it would no longer be the realization of enlightenment. Such flash of emptiness may be temporary, particularly if we try to possess that experience as a great flash of insight. Which is why when we back a ways, when we read the chapters where he discussed Vipassana practice, he talked about disowning rather than holding on to insight, that we don't want to create a new dwelling ground, a new dualistic fixation of what we perceive, but that we can learn to just rest in open awareness, wakefulness, and immediacy right on the spot. He said, and with this he says, if you can actually make a link with the wakeful quality of Buddha nature, the realization of emptiness could be said to be permanent, become stabilized, in other words. Although the concept of permanence doesn't really apply, because again, there's a realization that the experience is empty in and of itself, that it's self-existing. So the next section he talks about is titled Freedom from Names and Concepts. And this is where he really begins to ask some of the questions that, again, how do we know? What is our experience? How do we know what we know? It begins by saying there's not much you can say about ultimate or absolute truth. It's freedom from fixation. Freedom from fixation means being free of names and concepts. But if you take out the names and concepts, what's left? And he says there's just the shadow of the name and concept, but is it real? Is the name real or the concept real? Kind of reminds me of, actually when I read that, I was remembering sometimes when I was a child, sometimes repeating a word over and over to myself, and it would become just a sound and would sort of lose its meaning. And you kind of realize that part of how we develop language is attaching a particular sound to a particular concept, to a particular experience. And that's, with that, which is on a relative level incredibly useful. And it's be in great trouble if we couldn't develop language. But at the same time, the problem from a Buddhist point of view is then we become confused between the concept and actual experience. And we mistake concepts for the experience. Although if we really look at our experience, we realize that they're not the same thing. I could try to describe to you the taste of a piece of cheddar cheese or a chocolate bar, and I'd probably come words that would evoke something from you, but it still would not be the same thing as the actual experience. It wouldn't be the same as the actual taste. So that's what he means by the shadow, basically, that the concept points to something, but it's not really the real experience. And he gives some different examples, again, different questions to think about. He gives the example of a person's name that we could decide. He says we could decide to call our son George, but is he actually George? Or we could think about our own name, how we got, how we were given our names. And because we have a history of being called by that name and working with that name and identifying ourselves with that name, it has a certain meaning to us. But when we actually look at it, where is the Michael in Michael? Or the Miriam and Miriam, the Mel and Mel, the Robert and Robert, and so on and so forth. When we really look at it, we realize it's just a name that that if we were to name a child, that it's just a name that we decided to call him for the lack of an alternative. It's the name that our parents gave us. But there wasn't some essence in us that made that name. There's just a long case history that we developed, but nothing in the name itself. As he says, where did it come from? He says it's a concept, that a name is George, whatever, Michael, John, whatever. It's a concept. Where did that come from? How did we do that? And we come to realize that it really is an arbitrary decision, and in many cases based on all kinds of interdependent causes and conditions. But what he's asking us with this question and more to come is to look at our actual immediate experience and just see something beyond the kunzup all-covered conceptual surface that we usually skate by on. Where is the reality behind the concept, the reality behind the name? And as he says, it's just a shadow. It's not really anything substantial or graspable, nothing of real substance. So again, and he says this can be applied to all the things that we name in the world. He gives the examples of bread and pot. But he says the concept of bread doesn't have any background as such. Do we actually have a real feeling of the word bread in our mind before we've been told that something is bread? No. It's because of our experience, learning this particular language, English. If it was a different language, there'd be a different sound. So it's an arbitrary decision. Again, it has tremendous use, relative truth use in this world. But to think that there's something solid and definite in these labels and names, that's what he's trying to get us to see through. As he says, we call something bread, and it actually performs its function as bread properly, fully, and completely. But we don't think about these things. We just think, I had bread. And he says there's something very empty about the whole thing, that it's actually hollow, full of all kinds of hoaxes. You could say the bread itself doesn't call itself bread. We labeled it bread, so it's nothing in the bread itself that makes it bread, that's creates this label. And he says with this, we believe in all kinds of fantastic words, which we call our beliefs. I believe in blah blah, I believe in this, I don't believe in that. But he asks, what do we really mean by these things? What is it that we're really trying to grasp here? And can we grasp it? Do we really know the language completely? And even what is language anyway? And he says we decide to call language something deeper, or an utterance that comes from above us. But what do we mean by above us or deeper? And he goes, the more we look, the hollowness, as he says, still goes on. It goes on and on all the time. Again, tremendously useful on a relative truth level. But when we begin to look at what is the real substance, the real permanent nature of these things, where does this come from? It begins to dissolve a little bit. It becomes a little bit looser. He says it's like some kind of rumor had been built up for centuries and centuries, and we decided to believe that fantastic rumor. We decided to call it a reality. Interesting that he calls it a rumor. A rumor is like a report of uncertain or doubtful truth. And he actually uses an example, even though he says that he's going to be talking more from a Madhyamaka point of view. He actually uses a Yogacara example of someone with jaundice who sees white things as yellow because of the way that jaundice apparently affects eyesight. And he says, what if generations of people had seen white as yellow? And he says that could be happening to us. Seeing white as yellow goes against ordinary concept, but that could happen to us. That just with some change in causes and conditions, our whole idea of reality could shift and change. And he says, how do we know we're not doing that at the ultimate level, the real level? What do we mean by red, green, or yellow? How do we know we share the same experience? And he says, somebody has conveniently put these things together. We've been programmed since childhood so that we believe certain things. But how do we know we're not colorblind? Your red could possibly not be red at all. So basically what he's asking us to do is to really just look at the ways in which we're attached to conceptual relative truth, which again doesn't mean it's false. It's true under relative conditions and useful. But that again, we give it some sort of solidity or some kind of reality that's that when we really look, we come to realize isn't there. And he goes on with more questions. Something does not hold together in how we experience life. We say, I love you, or I'm your friend. But what do we really mean by that? What's behind the whole thing? And he says to really just look at our experience. What do these things mean to us? When we think about these things and see how our experience changes, our experience of people changes, that friends become enemies, enemies become friends. That eventually, as he says, is it just some kind of facade? Not even a kind of a facade, but an all-around facade. So here again, the illusory nature of things. When we really think about it, he says things don't seem to be as solid as we think, that we can't really fix or pinpoint on things with a degree of certainty that we do when we're totally caught up in our relative truth. So he says Shunyata is very real. The question is still, how do we really know about our part of reality? Can we really trust in that if we're fixed in our perceptions? And he says these are very simple questions, and they may be simple, but when we really think about them, we realize they're actually quite profound and significant. How do we really know about our part of reality? Can we really trust in that if we're fixed in our perceptions? He says when we see things, we label things. This is a jar, this is a table, this is a computer, this is Michael. We seemingly share these things together. We come to some kind of agreement together. But still, how do we know that we're saying the same thing? I'm absolutely certain that my idea of Michael is different from everyone else's idea of Michael, and that we probably have 20 or more different ideas here. Although there is still some sharing. As he says, we do somehow, by coincidence, all come together. He says one of Nagarjuna's ideas in connection with Shunyata is the realization is there's nothing we can hang on to that's actually a common idea. Everybody believes blue is blue, yellow is yellow, but nobody really knows because we have no way of talking with one another except in terms of our own conceptual language. And as we have different ideas, different opinions, different feelings. He says we could actually tune ourselves into a kind of make-believe. How much does the language we're learning make us think we share a world together, and how much are we actually, really sharing the world together? And he says this is what it really boils down to. We do not know who we actually are from that point of view. We have absolutely no idea. What do we mean by me or I? What do we mean by that? If we don't know what we mean by red or blue, we could also ask, what do we mean by me? And he says it's very tricky but simple logic. As a contemplative practice and a way to study Shunyata, you could think about this. Do we really know who we are? Do we really know what's yellow? Do we really know what's up and down? What's water? What's fire? He says, well, do we? So basically he ends this section by saying something about the nidanas, the links of interdependent origination that form the chains of karma. And he says the Shunyata principle is connected with the nidanas. He says the nidanas are coincidences which make things seem real and solid. And Shunyata is something that kind of deflates itself. Supposedly, by understanding the deflatableness of Shunyata, we can begin to realize the coincidence in the nidanas, or tendril is the Tibetan word. That is, certain things coincide, certain things seem to come together. Coincidence takes place in our life. And he gives the example that he and his students, people that he's talking to, remember this is a transcript from seminary, that he and his students might misunderstand each other and what they're talking about, but at the same time, something's brought them together in a very strange way. We may have entirely different ideas about the world, but we're still connected, as are all of we in this class tonight. And he says this is an example of the Nidana principle which brings things together. So in a moment I'll turn it over to John. I just wanted to present this in one other way that, again, I think this actually comes out of the Yogacara tradition more than the Madhyamaka tradition. But the idea is that along with the three natures that we've talked about before, the imaginary nature, which is entirely the kunsa world, the dependent nature, which is the world of causes and conditions, which we may be able to perceive as pure kunsa that we talked about last week. And then there's the perfectly established nature, which is ultimate truth, absolute truth. Along with this, there's an idea of, you could read in the Yogacara about the experience of people with no analysis, slight analysis, and thorough analysis. And the idea of no analysis is that's the world that most of us, most sentient beings live in, where they just take things as they seem to be based on habit, conceptual mind, karma, and so on. And that there's no real reflection. I think what Trungpa Rinpoche is asking us to do in this chapter by thinking on these questions is at least reach the point of slight analysis, where we begin to look and see through things. And ultimately, this leads to an experience of thorough analysis, where we actually see through fully, and then are able to let go, because we recognize fixation. And with that, actually can become able to experience reality in its fullest sense. So with that, I'll turn it over to John to continue with the chapter.
Thank you, Michael. So, why should we want to understand emptiness? Both what it is and to actually experience it. Because almost all sentient beings, all human beings, live in the world of confusion, samsara, the cycle of endless suffering around and around through the realms. What makes this function is samsara. It makes it, characterizes it, and gives it its ongoing momentum, is the belief or beliefs that we have in the existence of an I and the existence of others out there, lots of them. So that we're always in this problematic relationship between I and other. And that relationship involves pain. So the three basic pains are that if you don't like the other, you want to push it away, that's aggression. If you like the other, you think it's going to make you happier, you pull it towards you, that's passion or desire, whatever you want to call it. And if you think that the other is indifferent, that's the third option, which is moha, usually translated as ignorance, but that's a bad translation for it. Better translated as indifference. And so we're constantly relating to the things of our world in terms of desire, aggression, and indifference, and then combinations of these two, which produce all the subtle, or more complex rather, emotions like jealousy, pride, hatred, and so forth, of the six realms and others. And this is very sorrowful. It's very painful way to live. The key, or the sort of basic foundational assumption of samsara, that I and other exist, is, as Michael mentioned earlier, a belief in what's called own being, O-W-N, being. Svabhava in Sanskrit. Sva means own, bhava means being. And we attribute own being to I and to others, to all the things that exist, my glass of water, the sounds of this voice, and so forth. What own being consists of is basically three fundamental characteristics that we attribute to these things and lump together under the rubric of existence. One is that it endures, the individual thing or the collections of things, doesn't matter, endures through time. So I'm 79 years old. I've endured the 79 years. And each one of you has a story to tell about that too. And these glasses are maybe, a few years old, and they have that endurance through time. The second thing is that in order to talk about something enduring through time, you have to see it as unitary, one thing. We're talking about one thing at a time that endures through time. So we can talk about the glasses as being one thing, or we can break them down into their parts, and then they've got the lenses and the arms and so forth. And those are one things that endure through time. And the third thing is that these parts, that these things are independent. I am independent from you. These glasses are independent from the hand that holds them. They can be put down and separated from it. And these are the three aspects of what it means to exist. So the most fundamental. What Shunyata is saying is that they're not actually true. They're just ways of taking things, describing things in words, in ideas, but that what we actually experience right now is utterly impermanent, changing instant by instant. It's not one thing, it's multifarious. You're looking at your screen, and right now we're seeing what? I think 21 different little squares. I think 22 people. And all these colors and sounds and shapes. So it's not one thing, it's many. And not only that, but none of these things are independent. You can't have your screen with just, I mean, you can, but right now you've got all these different squares on it, and they're all interacting independently and dependently. And my voice and these sounds and all that. So things are not impermanent, they're not single, they're multiple, and they're utterly in dependence upon each other. They're a constant interaction. This is one way of describing shunyata. In order to think that things endure, we have to literally do that. Think. Assume that something is going to endure unchanged over time. To think that things are independent of each other. Again, you have to think about that. But in terms of our actual experience, it's not that way. Nonetheless, we go through our lives putting these conceptual interpretations on all the things of our lives, that things endure, that they are independent, that Steve Purdy is over there and Miriam is over here, and that all these things are independent, and that they are single, when in fact everything is made up of infinite parts, right down to atoms, protons, electrons, and beyond that to quarks, and now they don't even know if there really is an ultimate particle that things are actually made up of. So what we're being enjoined to do is to come out of this world of fiction, this world of I and other, which is fraught with all kinds of stories. The stories of the realms where, so let's take the hell realm. The hell realm is horrendous. Everything you see is an enemy. Everything you see is a source of pain. Everything you not just see, but everything you apprehend through any of the senses and your mind is utterly painful. All of samsara, all of believing in this self involves this kind of pain. Shunyata, emptiness, empty of what? Empty of all that. Empty of the belief in I and other, empty of the belief in endurance over time, of individual existence, and of single existence. All of that out the window, and instead what we have is the immediate direct perception of what we're experiencing right now, which is utterly changing, completely in a matrix, vivid, colorful, because it's stripped in shunyata, stripped of the conceptual overlays that say, oh yeah, Michael and John are different. Just an idea. I mean, maybe they are, maybe they aren't, doesn't matter. But when we see the world through our conceptual overlays, we gray it out. It's like wearing sunglasses. You're seeing the world constantly, your life, everything, through a veil of I, other, and the veil, all the concepts of good and bad, true, false, everything that inhabits that world. And so we want to get free of that, free of the suffering of samsara, of that constant game that we're playing as we walk down the street of, I like this, I don't like that, I like that person, I don't like the other, I'm going to go get revenge, I'm going to go make love, I'm going to, whatever it might be. We get free of that, really, that sorrowful I other trap. And instead, we are relating in the moment to this, to shunyata, empty of concept. That is what we're being enjoined to do. So, again, to go over these two truths, relative and ultimate, I agree with Michael very much. The Yogacharans had a better explanation of the relative truth, and they broke it down into two parts. The illusory relative, which is called, for those of you who know parikalpita, and the true relative, which is called paratantra. Now, what's meant by that? What's meant is that we see black shirt, pink skin. You see whatever you've got on your computer monitor. All these things are different. They have a relative existence, relative to each other. All the things of this world, the sounds, these words come out, and then there's silence. This comparison back and forth between existence and non-existence. This is the relative truth. This is the paratantra. This is the true relative truth. And we can't get away from it. You know, pink, green, loud, soft, sweet, sour, all the different things that we experience in this life. And then the illusory relative truth, the parikalpita, is that we attach names, labels, and judgments to the real relative truth. And we say, oh, that's a good one. This is a bad one. I want this one. And then we don't really see them in all of their vividness. This relative world of sunsets, like Tripp's picture there, and whatever it might be. And so we can begin the path by cutting through these conceptual overlays and beginning to see this relative world as it truly is. Bright green, sweet like sugar, loud, whatever it might be. And we begin to live in a much more vivid world. And then beyond that, we begin to understand the truth of emptiness itself. That these things that we are seeing stripped of concept, blue, green, sweet, sour, whatever it might be, horse, dog, person, are constantly changing. That constantly disappearing in the instant. Right now, everything that we are experiencing is a constant flux. And in that flux, it is very, very vivid. Because we can strip off the conceptual overlays. And we begin to live in a world in the moment that is vivid, meaningful, constantly telling us what it is. And true, because our conceptual overlays are not true. They're very neurotic, having to do with this game that we play of I and other, wanting and not wanting, desire and aversion and indifference. So he says that, he starts this section, ultimate truth is cosmic orphan. Ultimate truth implies that there is something behind the reality of kunzup. And this is just what I've been talking about. that behind the reality of all these different relative truths, this beauty of the phenomenal world as it arises and passes away in the instant, there is a reality beyond that. And it is characterized by a lack of own being, a lack of anything existing through time, anything being single, because nothing is single. Everything is just doesn't even exist. It's just constantly appearing and disappearing, a display. So, and nothing being permanent, everything being utterly impermanent. So we begin to see this reality, and it frees us and it seduces us because it's so beautiful. It's so vivid. We see it in glimpses sometimes. How do we experience this? Well, all people experience it because it's our fundamental nature. In between the gaps in our thoughts, in our mental events. But most people experience it, you hardly notice it. You pass on because you're obsessed with whatever that next desire or aggression is. And then, beyond that, we begin to study this. We tread the path, and we begin to experience it momentarily, in the instant, time to time, with doubts, self-doubts. Afterwards, we might think, oh no, that wasn't it. Other times we might think, gee, I think I had an experience of emptiness. And the third way is that you meet a teacher who can point it out to you. This is called pointing out instruction. In the Zen tradition, it's called satori. Sometimes in the Tibetan Tantric tradition, it's called the meeting of the minds, meaning the meeting of the minds of teacher and student. I'll give you a poem to read if you want. Trungpa Rinpoche's first Western student was a man named Richard Arthur, who usually used his refuge name, Kungadawa. He no longer is with us, he's passed. And towards the end of his life, he did a 2-year retreat in a cabin in the high desert of New Mexico. And he wrote a book of poems, which I recommend, called The Medium of the Breath. I think that's what it's called. Just look up Richard Arthur, Arthure, or Kungadawa. I think it's called The Medium of the Breath, and it's available online. He self-published it. And in it, there's this beautiful poem that he wrote to Trungpa Rinpoche, wrote about Trungpa Rinpoche. Robert Bird, you find it? Yes, it's called The Medium of the Breath, Robert? Yeah. He wrote this wonderful poem to Trungpa Rinpoche, in which he talks about Trungpa Rinpoche pointing this out to him, which is rarely talked about. And it moves me to tears. There's another terrific poem in that book that you might enjoy. It's called the Tonglen Tango. And it's a poem about Tonglen practice that you've probably never experienced before. Yeah, Richard Arthur. It's Arthure at the end. There's an E on the end of Arthur. Arthur. Okay, so absolute truth is freedom from fixation, which means being free of names and concepts. We're not bound by them anymore. We can still use them, but we're not living them. Things are not their names, which are just labels we affix to things and events. The name and the concepts, they're not real. They're just shadows. Shadows over our experience. This experience is really very hollow, full of all kinds of hoaxes, he says. The lack of connection or meaning of the names goes on all the time. There's always something fishy happening. So you think about putting things into words, and immediately you can start finding things fishy with it. He says we're involved with all kinds of rumors that have been built up for centuries and centuries, and we and others believe in these things. And these rumors or beliefs color the way we see the world or aspects of it. I mean, just the media, the news, newspapers, new television news shows, people talking about what's going on in this world is all full of myth, conceptual frameworks that have been accepted at the moment and which will pass out of fashion at some point in the future. We live in these dreams, and they're dreams that color the way in which we see the real events of the world as they happen now. He says things are actually very shaky underneath all these conceptions. We've been agreeing to believe in a fantastic rumor, and we've decided to call it reality. The reality of the presidential election looming, and Donald Trump and Joe Biden, and all the stories that are told, all these realities. It is like a lot of people having jaundice and seeing the world as yellow, as Michael said. This is all confused kunza, and it comes and goes. It's changing all the time. Whole groups of people could share common prejudices and conceptual lies. This is the world of samsara, and it's the world that Shunyata cuts through. We've been programmed since our childhood so that we believe in certain things, democracy, I don't know what, religion, being a good person, being generous, who knows? But how do we know that we are not all colorblind? That makes things very scary. That we're all sort of believing the same or talking about the same myth, even though we may mean very different things. He says, maybe we and everybody are mad. We don't know. And we're all just sort of agreeing common madness. There have been writers who've written stories like that. We say we are friends, but what does that mean for each of us? Perhaps something different for each of us. So Shunyata is very real. The question is still, how do we know about part of our reality? Can we really trust in that? When the experience of Shunyata happens, it's undeniable. It's a stripping away, down to the bone. It says one of Nagarjuna's ideas in connection with Shunyata is the realization that there is nothing that we can hang on to that is actually common idea. We don't really know if my red is your red. All right, this is what Michael's already said. We don't really know who we actually are. We put forth stories about ourselves all the time, right? I'm this person, I'm that person. You should admire me, you should love me. I'm gonna do this or do that. And it's all I, and it's all these fictions that we create. He says, as a contemplative practice and a way to study Shunyata, you can actually think about all this. Do we really know who we are? Do we really know what is yellow? The Shunyata principle is also contained, okay, we've gone through that, then Adhanas, which has to do with the fact that things coincide. Yeah, we can all share a common misunderstanding. So, Shunyata is what penetrates through all this misunderstanding, through all this conceptualization, and brings us to an experience of reality. And he talks about there are two types of dundam, countable and uncountable. It's really very simple. Countable dundam, countable absolute truth, countable shunyata is what we're doing here right now. We're describing it. All its parts, its different aspects, the way in which it comes together. Uncountable dundam, uncountable absolute truth, shunyata, is getting to the point where it's not describable. It's something that we only experience, and then we can point to it, but the pointing is just a pointing. He says, with uncountable dundam, everything is completely vast experience. This is the Madhyamaka level. The truth of pure kunzap, sorry, not there. The uncountable level of dundam is the experience of shunyata. The countable level, that means we can define it. We're trying to talk ourselves into it, as it were. To find it is a lesser experience. So, for instance, in the Heart Sutra, it goes, once the Blessed One was dwelling in Rajagriha at Vulture Peak Mountain, together with the great gathering of the Sangha of monks and the great gathering of the Sangha of Bodhisattvas. I memorized this a long time ago, more or less. At that time, the Blessed One entered the samadhi that expresses the Dharma, called profound illumination, meaning he was seeing emptiness. And at the same time, illumination. And at the same time, noble Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion. I can't stop. In any event, he sees it, and then Shariputra asks him, "What is this?" And he says, "Oh, Shariputra." And he starts by explaining it with this four-limbed argument. And he starts with the five skandhas, the first of the five skandhas, form. Form, feeling, perception, formation, consciousness, the five skandhas. Form is the first. And he says, form is emptiness, meaning it has no conceptual reality. Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form, meaning don't take the philosophy so that you believe that emptiness is a thing that exists, because emptiness is just another form. So form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Form is no other than emptiness. Emptiness is no other than form, meaning that that emptiness is the true nature of form. It's not a descriptor, it's what it is. This that we're sitting in the middle of right now. In the same way, feeling, perception, formation, and consciousness. And then he goes through all the elements of the Abhidharma. Eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind, speech, all of that. The nadanas. So this is countable dundam. It's explainable dundam. Uncountable dundam is the actual groundless, true experience of this. And it's something each one of us can experience, and it propels us further on the path. He says he's talking about pure kunzap, pure relative truth, stripped of false judgments, concepts, words. Blue is blue, red is red, and so forth. He says you become sane when you see this in a conventional sense, but you haven't become completely sane. There is still insanity. So the ego of dharmas, he says, that idea that things exist, is very hard to cut through because you still have some idea of the path and the teachings. and some idea of the person who is making the journey. All of that has to be given up to really get into uncountable, true, ultimate shunyata, ultimate absolute truth. You have to give up the idea of the path and the journey and you making it and getting someplace, because all of that reinforces subtler and subtler ego. You still have a sense of direction, although you experience many flashes of directionlessness. They don't last very long, they're just temporary. There is still the continuity of me making the journey until there isn't. And there is another residue in addition. Until you get to the highest tantric level, ati, dzogchen. It's called ati in Sanskrit, dzogchen in Tibetan. Each one of your achievements is always a way of messing up, he says. You leave deposits. And what he means by that is that every time you make a progress, and you actually have an understanding, then you say, oh yes, I've had an understanding. Now I understand this. And that in itself, as you measure your progress on the path, impedes your progress on the path. Because what this path is all about is getting to a place where there is no path, where there is no progress, where this is just reality, now, here. But it's necessary to tread the path to do that. He says, until you get to the highest tantric level or ati, each one of your achievements is also your way of messing up. You leave deposits behind, like a worm eating its way through a piece of wood and leaving excretions behind. What are these deposits? They're the idea of progress on the path. That's what they are. But you have to go through it. Pratyeka Buddhas, member of the Hinayanists, cut through the chain reactions of karma to achieve the 1.5-fold egolessness. That means they discover that I is an illusion, a lie, doesn't exist, bullshit, to put it in coarse terms. But they create further karma, the identity of being one who finds this out, one who is progressing on the path. So they've still got this subtler ego. Bodhisattvas immerse themselves in the world, but not completely. They have a much subtler understanding of egolessness, of the lack of existence of I and other. But not completely, fully, because they are still fixated on being religious, being good. And that's helpful. That's part of the path. You have to do that, go through it, but it is definitely an impediment. In the Dzogchen teachings, they look down at all the other teachings, including Tantra, including Dzogchen itself. The earlier, the Dzogchen divides into actually 4 levels. And the upper level, which is called the hard essence level, has 2 levels within it. And the very highest one looks down at the lower one and at the other 2 Dzogchen levels below that, 3, and finds them all lacking. Why? Because there's someone appreciating, however subtly, more and more subtly, appreciating their progress, appreciating becoming subtler and more knowledgeable on the path, because the ultimate, the end result is that this, right now, is it. This is where we're headed. I'm reminded, as I think of this, I've said it before, in Greek philosophy there was something called Zeno's paradox. And Zeno's paradox was that you fire an arrow at a target, and it continually goes half the remaining distance and never arrives at the target. That could be a metaphor for this path. So finally, we get the fourfold definition of ultimate truth, shunyata, dundam. Dun means ultimate, meaningful, it's meaning. The dun is actually the meaning, and dam means truth. So dundam is opposed to kunzup. Kunzup means the sort of the clothing or the what's the word? The clothing of all. So that's the relative truth. Everything is clothed in difference. One guy's wearing a bowler, another person's wearing a dress, and so it goes. But dundam is the ultimate truth, and so it has four definitions. The first is joy. Ultimate truth is joyous or pleasurable, without any reference point. No reference point. Nothing to refer to. It's just here all the time, everywhere. It is not dependent on the reference point of escape from pain or increasing pleasure. It is direct and precise. The second of this fourfold definition is purity. Ultimate truth is pure because the quality of shunyata experience is beyond any kind of egotism, indulgence, frailty. We don't have to create extra garbage in order to exist, but we exist in our own way, right now. Isn't that amazing? The less we move from where we are right now, the closer we are to absolute truth, shunyata. Third one is permanence. This doesn't mean longevity or eternity or existence through time. The idea is that the present moment, this now, is permanent. This is it. It's always going to be this. Always. Isn't that an amazing thought? It's always going to be here. Every moment of experience is full and complete in its own basic sanity and emptiness. It has nothing to do with longevity or eternity. And the fourth one is being. Not ego, but the existence of a fundamental reference point, self-existing being, reality. A quality of actually being here, there, wherever, properly and fully. You exist in your own way. There is no other way to exist. Since you exist as you are, you don't need any reassurance or the territoriality of egohood, of I and mine. These four dharmas of dundam are the basic reference points of ultimate shunyata, which is the same as saying the same thing as Buddha nature, Tathagata, another name for ultimate truth. It's here now. Dzogchen is so lovely in its arrogance. It just says all other paths are imperfect because they have the idea of harnessing a means to get to an end. There is no means and there is no end. This is it. Okay, so we could have a question and answer or comments, complaints. This is pretty ultimate stuff. We still have about 15 minutes. Shunyata. Come back to a point, and was it in this chapter? Did you mention it, Michael? That shunyata, which I think you did, which is literally the word means emptiness, is a fullness as well, because we come back to this beautiful world and experience it utterly vividly, full, rich, meaningful, full of compassion. So emptiness is a fullness too. We live our lives more fully in emptiness. We get in early. I could read you a couple of poems. One, I could read the Richard Arthur poem. Another one is a favorite poem of mine that I've loved over the years that I think is appropriate. Tennyson's Ulysses. You see, we're all Ulysses, each one of us. The last part of his poem is appropriate. Let's see. No, no comments. Is this material too? Oh, there we go. Mark. Great.
I'm just gonna talk and make no sense.
Got a what?
I'm just gonna talk and make no sense. So
Good.
just ultimately, like, I think I get it, but at the same time, any one of the ultimate and relative truth, in some sense, both have to be dropped. Is that true or is that not true?
I don't know. What do
I
you
mean,
think, Michael? Maybe it's true.
I think any concept of ultimate truth has to be dropped. It's a direct experience.
right.
So if it's almost by definition that anything we put into words is not it, or is at best a reflection of it, but not the real thing. That's at least my understanding of it.
And shunyata is wonderful, but at the same time, when we get down to its most basic, when we try to explain it or understand it, there really is no moment exactly. I mean, we live and enjoy the moment, and it is luminous, and it is wonderful, but at the same time, it technically speaking, like talking about that the arrow that doesn't hit the mark, there's no actual moment at its most fundamental. I mean, we experience it. But I'm saying we can't really explain it in shunyata.
We certainly can't grasp it. You're right.
But we do experience it.
Yeah.
So it's there. And in the world around us that we enjoy, experiencing it in the moment is wonderful, but at the same time, well, everything kind of exists in the moment, and yet it really doesn't. But I don't know. Now I'm trying to explain the unexplainable.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, you're doing great.
Yeah, that was pretty good, I thought.
I think you're being generous, but thank you.
No, seriously, on a conceptual level, we think that the people around us are going to be the same people from moment to moment, and more or less things often. I mean, it's hard to say how much they really are versus how much we just see what we want to see. But really, it's both exciting and it can be scary too.
Thank you.
Anybody? 9 minutes.
I'll bite before we go.
Oh, good, Barbara.
I mean, these teachings for me, I feel like I'm drinking from a fire hose. You can barely taste the water because the information is so, overwhelming. So I'm trying to integrate, right, this idea of these levels of truth that we've described and sort of the practical realities of day-to-day life, which we experience in relative truth. So, if I'm in a car and a car in front of me jams on the brakes, I'm not going to say, well, from moment to moment, this experience will change, and I'll contemplate that. I'm going to hit the car and I'm going to wind up in the hospital. Right. So it's that we operate in relative truth for our practical lives in order to, keep our bodies safe, keep other people safe, so that they may hear the Dharma and reach enlightenment. But in our deeper view, we perceive the things around us as ultimate truth, so that we don't get hooked, we don't get klesha, right? We don't get stuck with like, dislike, etc. Is that the way to weave in sort of how we behave on a day-to-day life on a practical level? We go to work, we buy things, we get change, and how we perceive the world on an ultimate truth, so that we're just, I don't know, so we can sort of be realistic in our own existence. Does that make any sense?
Is there a question or in response that you're looking for?
Yeah, am I conceiving of this correctly? Like, how do we integrate what we know about ultimate truth in our day-to-day lives without losing sense of a practicality in our day-to-day lives?
Oh, it will change the way you live your daily life. Maybe. Everyone is different. Everyone is different. I mean, look at Patrul Rinpoche, who spent his life as a wandering beggar. The only thing that's permanent is this, the present moment. And but everyone is different. Other people you might remain a businessman. What do you think, Michael?
I think that's true. And also, ultimate truth doesn't mean relative truth is false. I think it's truth. But I think you're onto something in that it does, or some recognition of ultimate truth does change the degree to which we get fixated or really caught up in relative truth. So that, there's not, as John was saying, we don't get caught up in the kleshas, we don't get caught up in as much, absorption and some, views of self and other and so on. But ultimate truth and relative truth, they're not opposites. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. It's not as simple as that. I mean, in some level, you get really extreme relative, like in the imaginary nature, like Trungpa Rinpoche was saying, where, we have people who are psychotic, which what you read in the chapter last week. That's a whole nother thing. Like, in the questions and answers, because somebody was trying to say, well, how different is it really? It says, well, if somebody thought fire and water were the same thing, you wouldn't invite them to take a shower in your fireplace. It's harmful. And, but that's a real extreme. It's more, I think I think for us, at least at this point, at least for me, it has to do with, loosening the degree to which I hold on to certain things. And I think ultimately someone who fully recognizes ultimate truth is actually most practical, except that it's not that you lose that practicality. It's just that the world, it's sort of like what it says in the chant, the Kagyu lineage chant, this meditator who rises in unceasing play. That's really it.
That's it. The rising in unceasing play. That's what's
But it
being.
doesn't mean that you lose practicality, because again, they're not exactly opposite, but you do see the illusory nature of some aspects of that practicality. And I was thinking, like the experience of going to different countries, and like if you went to somewhere in the rural South and tried to pay somebody with a €5 note, they would look at you like you had three heads. They would know, or they run you off. And yet in Europe, it's valuable. Here, if you took a $5 bill, they'd accept it in a rural area. But if you go to rural France, they wouldn't want a $5 bill. It's just a piece of paper again. So it's real, but it's illusory. Yeah.
Miriam has her hand raised.
Yeah, I just want to say that in our day-to-day, I think we become more skillful. Our reflexes are sharper. Judgment is better. But also one thing I noticed is that I noticed this today doing therapy with a client who typically I find very difficult, had judgments about her character, and yet, I try and stay empathic, but today I was able to drop the judgments, and it leads to a very different kind of experience when you can do that as well in life, towards people who are not cooperating or cause you trouble, to drop the judgments, to remain with the reality of the situation. And in that way, I think you become more skillful. But anyway, so this is kind of getting around the question of the relative truth. And, I think in parallel, the absolute truth is, for me, more difficult to access, in that, well, I always feel like I have a choice. It's always about realizing where I'm at, caught in my head, and changing track. And I have to make that choice volitionally. I have to make a decision and realize, okay, I'm caught in my stories. Let me get into this, full reality, the shunyata, just experience everything fully, drop the concepts. And it's always about making the decision to operate, perceive differently. And I don't know if that ever changes.
Well, I think we should probably close at this point. Thank you, Miriam. And Michael, if we put up the chants. You're muted, Michael.
Yeah, I can put them up and I can recite them because we've lost our previous chanter.
Thanks. So you'll mute all.
Yeah. So we'll close by reciting a prayer for peace and dedicating the merit generated through our study and practice and discussion to the merit of all sentient beings. By the blessings of enlightened and compassionate ones, by the power of my positive actions of 3 times and my prayers of pure aspiration, may wars, conflicts, epidemics, and all other maladies dissolve in this world, and may the earth and all who live on this earth enjoy the abundance of well-being. May all learn to live lovingly with each other. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great East, may the lotus garden of the Rigden's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Michael.
Todd. Thank you,
John.
Michael.
Thank you all.
Thank
Good
you.
night,
Good
everyone.
night.
Good night,
Night.
everyone.
Good night.
Well.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye, Michael.
Good night. See you tomorrow.
Okay.